Hey everyone, I'm back for another edition of True Crime AHS. Today we're diving into Freak Show. American Horror Story's 4th season featured a variety of characters that were based on real-life figures, and a few of them were involved in some serious true crimes. Before we jump in, make sure to subscribe to the channel for all your AHS needs. We have more true crime explorations and the latest on the upcoming season of AHS Double Feature. We also have a ton of breakdowns from past seasons of the show.
The children forgot that they loved me. The freaks were stealing them just like before. I knew what I had to do.
Let's begin with one of the most terrifying killers that we've ever seen on American Horror Story, Twisty the Clown. His terrifying picnic introduction in Freak Show will forever be etched into my memory. As we learn in Freak Show, Twisty was dropped on his head as a child and developed a mental disability, but that didn't stop him from his carnival career and passion for performing. By 1943, he worked as a traveling clown for Rusty's Westchester Traveling Carnival. But two evil dwarfs were jealous of his popularity, so they spread rumors that he was inappropriate with children. Overnight, Twisty was unable to find work. His lifelong dream was over and his reputation was forever tarnished. Couple with that, the death of his mother, Twisty attempted to commit suicide but failed. The shotgun blew off his lower jaw, but he survived. To hide his hideous injury, he wore a prosthetic smile.
Well, hello, beautiful.
Twisty would dedicate his life to saving children from their evil parents, which basically meant that he would kill innocent people, kidnap unsuspecting children, lock them up in cages against their will, and scare the living hell out of people. Twisty's reign of terror continued until Halloween and the arrival of Edward Mordrake. I'll get to him later. Mordrake asked to hear Twisty's tragic life story and deemed him worthy to join them in the afterlife. At last, the killer clown finally found his home in Mordrake's ghostly troupe. Clearly, Twisty's story is a work of fiction, but this monster is inspired by a real-life killer clown, John Wayne Gacy, who made a living dressing up as a clown named Pogo for children's birthday parties. Fittingly, John Carroll Lynch, who played Twisty, also played John Wayne Gacy in Season 5, and we even see Gacy with clown makeup on during Devil's Night. Now, there are some big differences between Twisty and Gacy. Twisty was more of a misguided murderer, while Gacy was a stone-cold psychopath. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy raped and killed at least 33 young men. All of his murders were committed inside of his ranch house outside of Chicago, Illinois, which was also referenced in AHS 1984. According to Gacy, he would lure his victims back to his home, then torture and rape them before strangling them to death. He hid the bodies, at least 26 of them, in a crawl space in the back of his house. The others were dumped elsewhere on his property and by a nearby river. By December of 1978, an investigation into the disappearance of teenager Robert Pice led authorities to Gacy's arrest. At the time of his conviction, Gacy was the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. For more on Gacy's haunting story, make sure you check out this episode of True Fiction on the channel right now. Oh, and Gacy's work unfortunately lives on. He was also an artist, and his series of haunting self-portraits are straight nightmare fuel. Next up, let's talk about Freak Show's Jimmy Darling, portrayed by the one and only Evan Peters. Jimmy was born with a condition called ectrodactyly, in which the fingers or toes are fused together to resemble claws. Jimmy is the son of two other Freak Show performers, the stupendous strongman Del Toledo and the bearded woman Ethel Darling. Due to his deformity, he was exploited his entire life. His father even sold tickets to watch Jimmy's actual birth. Del would eventually abandon Jimmy and Ethel, and the pair packed up and traveled the country from Freak Show to Freak Show. Years later, they all crossed paths again in Jupiter, Florida. Jimmy was a charming young man and extremely loyal to his fellow freaks. He also had dreams of leaving the show behind and trying to live a normal life. In order to make some extra cash, Jimmy used his God-given extremities for, pleasure, and a lot of ladies lined up for his services.
I took in that new roadside attraction, wandered into an empty tent, and the real show began.
He was also sick and tired of the treatment he and his fellow freaks would have to suffer through. It reached a boiling point when he saved the twins Bette and Dot Tattler from getting arrested for the murder of their mother. Jimmy wasn't going to let them get caught, so he slit Detective Bunch's throat, and together they disposed of the body. The murder wasn't very Jimmy-like if you ask me, but it brought the freaks closer than ever before. Look, Jimmy had a long and complicated story arc for Season 4, including a face-off with Twisty the Clown. He was also framed for the Tupperware Party massacre at one point, and even tricked into donating his hands to pay for legal services. Stanley sucks, not to mention that he had to deal with the monstrous Dandy Mott. But luckily for Jimmy, the season ends on a happy note. Extremely rare for AHS, we see him and the twins living happily ever after. Bette and Dot are pregnant with Jimmy's baby, and they spend Halloween watching Elsa Mar's TV special. As for the real-life inspiration, Jimmy Darling was modeled after the famous performer Grady Stiles Jr., also known as the Lobster Man. Born in Pittsburgh in 1937, Grady, like Jimmy, was born with ectrodactyly. Stiles was part of a whole family line of people who had the same condition. Just like Jimmy on the show, he was forced to become a sideshow act at a young age and became an abusive alcoholic. Unfortunately, Stiles' life doesn't mirror the happy ending that Jimmy had on AHS. Grady's condition left him unable to walk, so he learned to use his hands and arms to get around, causing him to gain incredible upper body strength. As years passed, Grady led his own lobster family act due to 2 of his 4 children being born with variations of ectrodactyly. This is where things get a bit dark. You see, as I mentioned earlier, Stiles was known to be an abusive drinker. He would often physically and emotionally hurt his family. In 1978, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, his oldest daughter, Donna, fell in love and became engaged. Grady did not support this union by any means, and on the night before the wedding, he picked up a shotgun and murdered the young groom. He was 17 years old. He was brought to trial, and with absolutely no remorse, Stiles openly confessed to killing the man and was convicted of third-degree murder. At the time of the conviction, prisons were not equipped to take care of an inmate with ectrodactyly, so Stiles was sentenced to house arrest and 15 years probation. Following the trial, Grady would stop drinking and remarry his first wife, Mary Teresa. As the years went on, sadly, Grady soon began drinking again, and his family claimed that he became even more abusive. This would lead to his inevitable end in 1992. For a little background, the local community despised Grady. He was notoriously verbal and physically abusive to people around town. And in November, Stiles was murdered in his Florida home by 17-year-old family friend and sideshow performer Chris Wyant. In court, it was revealed that Wyant had been paid $1,500 by Stiles' wife, Mary Teresa, according to the Los Angeles Times. But Stiles' son, Grady Stiles III, disputes the claim that Teresa had him murdered. Regardless, Chris Wyant was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. Harry was given life in prison for his role as the mastermind, and Mary was given 43 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. On the day of Stiles' funeral, it was reported only 10 people showed up. Now let's focus on Wes Bentley's performance as Freak Show's mysterious Edward Mordrake. Bentley appears in the 2-part Halloween episode of Freak Show as the 19th century English nobleman with a second face on the back of his head. On the show, Mordrake's front face was all business, but the back was a nightmarish party for one, and it would whisper depraved thoughts that only Mordrake could hear.
No one else could hear what it said, but it whispered to Edward incessantly of things only spoken of in hell.
The evil second face eventually drove him insane, and he was committed to Bedlam Asylum. Eventually, he escaped the asylum and joined a freak show where he could live a life free from the public eye's hatred. Unfortunately, on Halloween night, he was driven mad by the evil face and killed his entire fellowship before killing himself. On the show, the freaks have superstitions that any performance on Halloween, even trivial ones, risk summoning Mordrake. Once he appears, the whispers of his second face can be vaguely heard telling him what it desires: the life of one of the freaks for their own show.
Not the one.
Now, Wes Bentley's character was based on a popular urban legend, but any stories of a real Edward Mordrake may be nothing more than a tall tale.
It's fiction. We made it up.
For years, people bought into the supernatural story of Mordrake before it was discovered to have been a fictional creation of Charles Lowton Hildreth, who fabricated his story for a sensationalist article in the Boston Sunday Post in 1895. Somehow, a year later, Mordrake's tale would end up in a science textbook, Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, in 1896, and the legend was born. According to the literature, he had an unusual deformity, a small face, supposedly female, on the back of his head. The account is filled with heavy melodrama, including quotes from a frightened Mordrake. "No imagination can conceive the dreadful temptations it sets before me. For some unforgiven wickedness of my forefathers, I am knit to this fiend, for a fiend it surely is." This led to Mordrake secluding himself in a room before committing suicide at the age of 23. Let's be honest, this likely did not happen. In fact, the origin of the black and white photograph that claims to show Mordrake and his devil twin in profile, which has appeared in internet postings since 2007, is unknown. Now, it has been suggested that Mordrake might have suffered from a congenital defect known as diprosopis, also known as a craniofacial duplication. The exact description of diprosopis refers to a fetus with a single trunk, normal limbs, and facial features that are duplicated to a certain degree. What do you think of all this, Frakes?
This one was invented by a writer.
Next, let's talk about the conjoined twins Bette and Dot Tattler, played by AHS legend Sarah Paulson. The sisters are nearly identical, but after a short conversation with them, you can definitely tell them apart. Bette is much more gentle, sweet, and a bit naive, while Dot is much more stern and protective. She's more cautious and controlling, sometimes mean, to ensure that the twins don't get taken advantage of. They're living with their mother, but are basically prisoners in their own home. She's downright evil to them and wants to keep them out of the public eye.
What do you think would become of our lives if people around here learned what lived on this farm?
What are our lives now?
One night, they have a heated argument and Bette stabs her mother with a kitchen knife. And later on, Dot would stab her sister with a pair of scissors. After the milkman swings by, the twins are discovered and sent off to the hospital for evaluation. Here's where Elsa Mars comes into the picture. She convinces the twins to break out of the hospital and become the star attraction of her cabinet of curiosities. A whirlwind of drama ensues, and the twins catch the eyes of some famous and wealthy audience members, the Motts. Gloria wants to purchase the twins so that Dandy can be more productive with his time. Elsa and the twins refuse, but it wouldn't be long until she shipped them off to Mott Manor because they were stealing the spotlight from her. Fortunately, Bette and Dot get a happy ending in Freak Show. Sure, they agree to marry Dandy, but they're secretly working with Jimmy and Desiree to knock him out during dinner. They then get to watch Dandy die in Houdini's water torture cell. Some sweet revenge. We last see the pregnant twins cuddle up with Jimmy as they watch Elsa perform on TV. We're hoping we'll get to catch up with the growing Darling family in a future episode of the series.
How my girls feeling?
Just fine. All of us.
As for their real-life inspiration, the twins are most likely inspired by the famed sideshow sisters Violet and Daisy Hilton. Their tragic story began in England in 1908, where they were born fused at the hip. Their mother conceived the twins out of wedlock and was convinced that their deformity was a punishment from God. She basically sold them off to her midwife, Mary Hilton, who saw the commercial potential in the pair. The girls were put on display in a British pub for anyone willing to pay an admission fee. The girls were kept captive for the majority of their lives and treated as property. They were forced to play instruments for hours on end and eventually into the carnival sideshow circuit. They were continuously reminded that if they didn't play nice, they would be institutionalized. Remind anyone of Elsa Mars? By the time they were in their 20s, the sisters became vaudeville legends and were featured alongside the likes of Charlie Chaplin and Bob Hope. No surprise here, but the twins reaped no rewards for their success. They weren't privy to any of the contract details, nor able to profit from their popular performances. But in 1931, the sisters sued their owners, managers, and finally gained freedom from their contracts. They were also awarded $100,000, which would be worth around $1.7 million today. The following year, the twins appeared in Todd Browning's 1932 horror film, Freaks. Unfortunately, as sideshows became less and less popular, so did the twins. They tried making a comeback in the burlesque community, but they weren't successful. The sisters were forced to take a job at a grocery store in North Carolina. Their tragic story came to an end just 4 days into 1969, when they didn't show up at work and their boss called the police. Authorities searched their home, where the sisters were found dead, victims of the 1968 flu pandemic. Finally, let's talk about a fan favorite played by the great Naomi Grossman. We first met Pepper way back in Asylum, but it wasn't until Freak Show that we learned about her life story. Pepper and her husband Salty were part of a double act in Elsa's Cabinet of Curiosities. She was born with microcephaly, and her family abandoned her at an orphanage because of the disorder. When she was 18 years old, Elsa Mars took her in, and she would become the first member of her troupe.
When this strange-looking little one looked at me, it was the first time I had ever felt unconditional love.
She would soon form a close bond with many others in the group, most significantly a loving romance with Salty, and the two would get married in a mock ceremony. The couple would perform in Elsa's show as a sort of clown act, cheering up the audience throughout the many performances. But in early 1953, Salty passed away during his sleep after suffering a stroke. The horrible Stanley convinced Elsa to let him take care of the funeral arrangements, and you know what happens next. Stanley sucks. After Salty's heartbreaking passing, Pepper was never the same. The Freak Show would soon break up, and Pepper was forced to live with her sister, who pretty much treated her like a slave. Her brother-in-law was also evil as hell, and they actually framed Pepper for the murder of their infant son, and she was subsequently sent off to Briarcliff Manor against her will. So the story that Sister Mary Eunice tells Lana Winters at the beginning of Asylum,
she's not harmless. She drowned her sister's baby and sliced his ears off.
It's total BS. In one of her greatest moments from Asylum, Pepper is abducted by those mysterious aliens and transformed overnight. She was given high intelligence, confidence, and some spice when dealing with the evil Dr. Arthur Arden. She puts him in his place and oversees the well-being of Grace and her new baby.
They'll take you, open up your head, and stir your brain with a fork. And when you return, you'll experience firsthand how people treat us freaks.
It turns out that Pepper and Salty were inspired by Slitsy Surtees, also known as Slitsy the Pinhead. He was an early 1900s Barnum and Bailey sideshow performer with the same neurodevelopmental disorder that we saw in AHS. He had the cognizance of a 3-year-old and could only speak in single-syllable words. Slitsy made his film debut in the 1928 circus drama The Sideshow, but he's best known for his role in Freaks, which has been noted to be a huge inspiration for the entire season of Freak Show. Fortunately, the tragic story that we saw unfold in American Horror Story was a work of fiction. Hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this video and want to see more AHS true crime. I'll be back next week with another season of American Horror Story. Thanks for watching.
Who the hell is this?
Wait, you didn't hire him?